Well, hello everyone and welcome to Stamp Chat. I'm Heidi Rhodes. Today's Stamp Chat presenter is Mr. Rick Barrett. Mr. Barrett has collected stamps for the past 52 years thanks to his late uncle and has enjoyed the hobby ever since. Mr. Barrett worked in a stamp store for 3 years as a youngster and has enjoyed expanding his philatelic awareness ever since. He joined the American Philatelic Society almost 40 years ago and is a member of several other organizations devoted to collecting. His first book, Buffalo Cinderellas, was wonderfully received and has won 2 awards, including an APS Gold Medal Literature Award. He's a big proponent of the APS and loves sharing interesting philatelic stories, many of them uncovered at the APRL and through their help. Today's Stamp Chat is sponsored by, you guessed it, the APRL. The American Philatelic Research Library is one of the largest philatelic libraries in the world. With 4 miles of books and journals, the APRL is your source for learning and research. APS members have access to the library, and our staff is always available to assist you. Make your mark today by adopting a book and supporting digitizing reference materials so that philatelists like you around the world have access to the books and journals they need. The Adopt a Book program preserves the past for the future. Visit stamps.org to make your donation today. Now, before we begin our presentation, a few items to take care of. This is a webinar, and as such, all audio and video are turned off, respectively, of course, and we encourage you instead to go ahead and use that chat box as liberally as you like. But please do save your questions for the Q&A box, which is available at the bottom of your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on the APS YouTube. So we encourage you to go over to the APS YouTube, like and subscribe this video, and share with your stamp clubs. Now for our feature presentation, an overlooked giant of philately, Mr. Rick Barrett. Thanks so much for joining us from Texas.
Absolutely. Great to see you, Heidi. Happy holidays. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I love watching Stamp Chats on the YouTube channel, and it's a real thrill to be able to share in this. So I want to go over a little bit about what we'll spend our time on. First, I'll share a little bit about Buffalo, New York, and the Pan American Exposition, and then a little bit about myself and the connection to the stamps pertaining to that. Then we'll tell the story of an overlooked giant of philately and hope you enjoy his life story. I'll do a very quick pitch for my book, Buffalo Cinderellas, at the end, and then I'm happy to take whatever questions you may have. So let's get started. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and I'm come from a family of stamp collectors. My late grandfather was a stamp collector, as was my late uncle and late brother, and my dad's been a stamp collector. So we embraced the hobby, and growing up in Western New York, we learned some of our history, which included the Pan American Exposition. And consider it a World's Fair. It was really a big deal that occurred from May 1st, 1901 to November 2nd of 1901, about 6 months. And why did they choose Buffalo? Well, it had a really robust economy at the time, and it was a great distribution center. And they drew a circle around Buffalo, and they realized that almost 50% of the population of the United States could reach Buffalo within a 1 day's train ride. Look at this circle. It goes all the way up into Quebec and Montreal, then down here on the right to Boston and New York City and Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, west over to Columbus and Chicago and Milwaukee. And it was just an amazing place for the Pan American to be. I mean, to get almost half of the country there within a day's train ride was really spectacular. In fact, over 8 million people came to the Pan American Exposition. Now, as they were forming committees and getting ideas ready on what to do at the exposition, I'm really disappointed that one of them didn't come about. I really wish it had, and it was this. It would have been wonderful to see a giant buffalo with spotlights coming out of its eyes and an observatory and restaurant on the top. How grand would that have been to see? And yet that didn't happen, but this did. And these are the four welcoming pillars for the Pan American Exposition. This is one of my favorite shots, actually. I love the flag, especially in relation to the size of the people there. And the exposition looked like this at night. Since Buffalo had recently harnessed the uh, electricity from Niagara Falls nearby, they were able to showcase electricity to many people that had never seen it before. On the grounds at night were almost 250,000 light bulbs, and it was an amazing sight to see. Well, the post office had to get involved, of course, which is great. And these 6 transportation themed stamps were issued, and they were our country's first bicolored commemoratives. You may remember that the 1869 series had some 2-color stamps, yet those were definitives, and these were our first commemoratives that were 2-colored. Besides these stamps, there were numerous souvenir stamps issued for the Pan American Exposition, issued beforehand to promote the Pan Am. These are some of them. And you may remember a previous stamp chat where we talked about these stamps, Niagara Falls and the Bridge and Whirlpool stamps. They are associated with a fellow named William B. Hale, who's the huckster in my book. And there was also this set of 20 building stamps, a wonderfully colorful set. There's actually 19 pavilions from the Pan American Exposition grounds, plus one of Niagara Falls here that you can see. And they came out in 5 different colors. They were inexpensive for me to obtain when I was a youngster. I got my first stamp album in 1968, and I used to find these in the penny bin, actually. And so I stashed away as many as I could. And these actually today are not expensive to obtain or put a collection together. Out of the 100 total, 20 stamps in 5 different colors, you might find them anywhere from $1.50 up to $4 or $5, depending on condition. And I must say that it's not easy to put a complete set together that is wonderfully centered and with no gum disturbance. I'm still upgrading some of the ones in my own collection after 52 years, and but they're an easy set to collect, and you can probably complete it within a matter of maybe 3 to 8 months or so, depending on how hard you look. I will also add that the purple ones came out last, and those are the ones you'll see least frequently. The other colors you'll find pretty easily. Now, I was stashing all that I could, and about 20 years ago or so, I said I would like to assist other collectors that would enjoy collecting these stamps, and I would like to put together a 12 to 16 page pamphlet showing these stamps in color and putting a numbering system together. And there's been a numbering system for certainly all postage stamps by Scott and Stanley Gibbons and such, and even Christmas seals, but these had never been numbered. So I was excited to do that. And so I didn't really know how to begin. So I went to a stamp show in Houston, Texas, where I live, and I met this gentleman, Jonathan Topper, a fine man who was very instrumental in encouraging me. By this time that I met him, I had come to understand that there were 2 men associated with most of the Pan American Exposition stamps. Back then they were called poster stamps or seals or stickers. It wasn't until 1959 that the term Cinderella was coined. And Mr. Topper listened to me, and he encouraged me not only to create the numbering system, but also to tell these fellows stories. And I can say that it was quite a daunting task to consider telling the stories of 2 men, and I found out one was a good guy and one was not, and tell the stories of 2 men who were born in the 1870s who were not famous. And I didn't know how to begin, and I thought that I would end up just like this, trying to find a needle in a haystack and just uncovering a little bit here and a little there. And that's not how it was. Instead, I wound up in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, which is a wonderful community, and it's home to the American Philatelic Center. The American Philatelic Society and the American Philatelic Research Library are there. And the first time I came in 2012, I fell in love with the place. In fact, I went to the old library at that time, And then research assistant Scott Tiffany had pulled almost 50 items for me. And there was a note at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning that these were set aside for Mr. Barrett to go through. And Scott is now our head librarian in this new wonderful library. And I love going back, still doing research for these two fellows. And it was a wonderful experience to get started on my book and the gentleman and the huckster that I was telling the stories about. Now, tonight we're going to talk about an overlooked giant of Philately. And before I get into his life story, I want to tell why I feel that way. His name is Raynor Hubble, and he actually had two philatelic lives. He had one until he reached about 27 years old. He still sold a few stamps for the next 6 or 8 years. It's been documented, but he had his first philatelic life for his first 27 years or so. Then he went into corporate America, and he had a job till the late 40s. And then he began collecting again and was a dealer that was very prolific in so many ways. So he had two philatelic lives, and I'll wrap up at the end there why I consider him an overlooked giant. So to begin his life story, this is the 1880s census entry that showed his name at the bottom. His dad is at the top, Alfred Hubble. His mom is Maria, and his brother Alfred was beneath his mom. And then at the bottom is Ray, and they called him Ray in the town. I must mention that this image shows that he was 7 years old when he was actually only 6 years old. And Ray began not just collecting stamps, but coins as well. And as he became a teenager, he started doing mail order. And he did it out of the family home here at 172 Franklin Street. And this apartment, which has been above, it's still there. This is above several pubs over the years, is where the Hubble family lived, and Raynor did his mail order. Now, he was an educated youngster, and he went to Bennett High School and was in the cycling club. Here it's noted that he was vice president of the Bennett High School Wheel Club. And by age 21, he was appearing in the society columns in many of Buffalo's 12 newspapers. 12 newspapers, that'll tell you how hopping the city was at the time. And here it mentions that Mr. Hubble was visiting a cottage at Crystal Beach, which used to have a wonderful amusement park, actually, that I went to as a kid. So also at age 21, Raynor Hubble was the first person to open a retail outlet for the purpose of buying, selling, and exchanging stamps, which Buffalo had ever had. He opened Buffalo's first stamp store, and that was quite a deal. And you might consider him the father of philately in Buffalo. He was actually involved about 7 years prior with a stamp journal in Buffalo that he was editing. And so here's when he opened his first retail outlet. It was here at the Palace Arcade. This is a picture close to the time he opened it. And this is the Main Street entrance. If you walked into this through these doors, you would go down all the way to Washington Street, where there was a giant outdoor market. And people used to come from all over the state, Albany, Syracuse. They would even come from New York City by train to go to that market. So Mr. Hubble felt that he could get a lot of traffic as people came in that Main Street entrance. Here's how it looks today. And it's actually a wonderfully restored building now. And so Mr. Hubble did his retail sales there as well as his mail order sales. This is the earliest cover that I've ever seen of Raynor Hubble. This is from 22 Palace Arcade from December 10th, 1895. So he was 21 years old then. He was mentioned a month later in the 1896 Buffalo City Directory, and he took out an ad there. You know, he was mentioned not just as a resident of the city, but also that he had a stamp business, and he paid to get a bigger ad there. Here's his regular mentions, and beneath that was his regular ad over the Merchant's Worm Tablet ad. If you had something that needed a speedy cure for anything, that's you could get those. And so he continued to do mail order, and here is a cover from May 1st, 1896 with a printed corner card at 22 Palace Arcade. And a month later, he he mailed out this cover to Paris, France. Now, this was June 2nd of 1896. And what's amazing about this, I had this in my collection, and about a year after I added this cover to Paris, I found nearly the exact same cover mailed to London, to Great Britain, the same day. So talk about philatelic miracles. That was such an amazing score. So it was such a fun thing to find two items from the exact same mail out on that day. By the fall, Mr. Hubble had put out a price list of postage dues. We're up to September of 1896, and Mr. Hubble was a prolific, I mean prolific advertiser in not just stamp journals of the 1890s, but also in the conventional newspapers as well. His stamp journal advertising took him all the way that fall out to Denver, Colorado, and his ad appeared in the Rocky Mountain Stamp. Here it is on the right, advertising that price list of postage dues. And the same month, in the American Philatelic Association, this quarter page ad mentioned that postage dues were their specialty, the Raynor Hubble Stamp Club specialty. So he was definitely getting the word out that he was a player in retail stamps. Now, after that, he was noted to send out these Scott Stamp and Coin Company catalogs or lists from 1896, and he stamped his same information there, and he would offer catalogs and stamp albums because he was a Scott agent for those supplies. In 1897, he wound up editing his very own stamp journal called the Buffalo Philatelist. This is the first issue from March 15th, 1897. He's the editor here. And I like what he puts here. This is some of the text inside. And Buffalo has been somewhat neglected as a field for philatelic operations in the past, but is sure to become more or less of a stamp center in the future. Our publisher, Raynor Hubble, is well known to philatelists in Buffalo and in all of the great cities and towns surrounding us. As a result of liberal advertising, we have also been able to build up a large mailing list of active stamp collectors in all of the world. So here's an example of one of his covers. This was from the same year, 1897. By then, his retail business had grown so big that he had to get a dual storefront, and he was at 1618 Palace Arcade, and he called himself the largest stamp business in the United States between New York and Chicago. Here's his storefront, rare postage stamps bought, sold, and exchanged, the Raynor Hubble Stamp Company. And this cover actually has Mr. Hubble's very own writing on it, as does this one. This is one from 1898, about a year and a half later, November of 1898, and the same corner card or cachet, but it mentions that he has moved to the Grand Court of the Ellicott Square building. One of the cool things about this cover is that it was mailed on a trolley car that went down Main Street that would pick up mail. So this is called wagon mail. So this is quite an interesting cancellation that you don't see very often. What was the Ellicott Square building? Well, here it is. In 1896, when it opened a couple years prior to Mr. Hubble moving there, this was the largest office building in the entire world. This was an amazing place. And there were several factors of why people would consider moving their businesses there. One, if you were in this building next door to it and you were on the 4th floor, you were going to walk up 4 floors. If you were in the Ellicott Square building, you could take the elevator up. There was also office to office telephone business, which was pretty new at the time. There were over 3,500 people that worked in the Ellicott Square building that came through that lobby every single day. So Mr. Hubble knew where to be. He went where the traffic was. And it was interesting that going through some boxes of family covers and stamps, I found 4 that have my great grandfather's name on it. And he was in 4 different places in the Ellicott Square building. 953 on this one, 341, 333 in the 1940s, and 433. So that was an interesting side note to find that my family had been there. And here's the elevator operators, a crew of 21 that would take you up two banks of elevators, one on that Main Street side and one on the Washington Street side. And they certainly were kept busy. This is the lobby as it appears today. And it's just a beautiful place with you can see the second story atrium there, and offices go around the outer part of the building. And I believe that this lower right area is where Raynor Hubble had his kiosk. There were 4 kiosks in the lobby, and I believe people would walk through towards this bank of elevators over here and past Mr. Hubble. What else drew people to having their own business there? Well, the mail service was incredible. There were 14 different collections every single day of the week and 7 deliveries every single day. Even on Sunday, there were 2 collections. So it was amazing to have that kind of service, especially for someone like Mr. Hubble, who did a mail order business. And here is where I believe he probably dropped some of his mail. This was near that Washington Street bank of elevators. And though it doesn't take mail, it's wonderful that they still kept that in the lobby. Mr. Hubble was advertising in so many different stamp journals, magazines. He was sending out price lists. And, one of the things about stamp journals of the 1890s, really the only difference in most of the ads in those journals was either the size of the type or the font. Maybe they did it in bold, maybe they did it in bigger size, but that was usually what you see when you go through those journals. Well, Raynor Hubble broke some new ground, and his ads began to have artwork in them. And here's a couple examples that appeared in a variety of stamp journals. This is the ABCs of stamp collecting here on the left, and Grand Court of Ellicott Square. Over here is Santa going down a chimney, and it mentions that don't you want Santa Claus to bring you a stamp album for Christmas? He gets them from us. So Mr. Hubble knew ways to attract people to his ads, and not just in the stamp journals, but also in some of those Buffalo newspapers. This is from the Buffalo Morning Express in 1899, and he was selling some of those souvenir stamps for the Pan American Exposition, 100 assorted for 10 cents. He also did an amazing amount of classified ads. If he couldn't afford a display ad, he certainly put out a number of these classified ads in all those newspapers. I love this second one on the bottom. Suppose every letter that leaves the city had a Pan American stamp on it. What would be the effect? Well, Mr. Hubble would make a penny or two, and the Pan American Exposition Company would get some nice PR. These came from the Ellicott Square building scrapbook that they have there in their archives, and I was privileged to look at that. So this was pretty neat. And how did Mr. Hubble sell these stamps? Well, they came in envelopes like this, 100 assorted for 10 cents a piece. And there's several variations of this same envelope. Some mention at the bottom how many were sold, 1 million, and it's more, and etc. And he was an amazing marketer of these stamps. And I want you to look here at this one here, which I call the Bison and Shield stamp. And this is the one that's specifically associated with Raynor Hubble. If you look in the lower left here, there's the harbor and the lighthouse of the city of Buffalo, and beneath it is RH Stamp Company, for Raynor Hubble Stamp Company. In the right, lower right, is the Ellicott Square building. They didn't have enough to write it all out, so they just put Ellicott and a square. So that's pretty cool for that stamp. And these were also sold on flag postcards like this. Now today, these are pretty tough to find. There were numerous ones, but they sell in the maybe $65 to $300 range for average ones. The interesting thing about it is that usually the stamps on there were not in the same place. They were all over the place, and it was really interesting to see the examples. The reverse of these also, there were 5 different versions of them, and we note them in my book. The rarest one like this was this one. sent to British Guiana. And it really shows the reach that Raynor Hubble had in his ability to reach not just in our country, but really globally through the advertising that he did. Well, remember those building stamps that we showed at the beginning, the set of 20? I began sorting them, and here's 100 different piles of them. And Mr. Hubble marketed those in envelopes like this. He called them the only stamp collection of Exposition buildings. These envelopes, like the others that we just saw, are really hard to find. Usually, if you do, there's no stamps inside, or maybe the stamps are stuck together. I think in 52 years, I've found 3 that have full sets in there, and they're just really tough to locate. Full sets came like this, and they were actually different in every envelope. This set actually was 4 blocks of 10 and then 4 blocks of 15. And the next one you might, if you bought 2 at the same time, let's just scroll up here. You might find the first one had the manufacturers and liberal arts building here at the top of this blue block. And the next time it might have the Temple of Music up there. So they were always different. And so here's a cover from Mr. Hubble's Grand Court address. This is from 1900. And let's zoom in on it a little bit here. And I believe this is Mr. Hubble. And here is the entranceway to that bank of elevators in the Ellicott Square building. He also mentioned in his book later on that he published that he had a helper. And I believe this helper is the one that put the stamps on those building envelopes as well as those postcards. So just a hunch, but I think that's a pretty good gamble. And around this time, this is from April 1900, but later on that summer, he issued 2 price lists. These are catalogs that are about 10, 12 pages or so. The orange and black and then the blue and white ones, these are not easy to find. They're about the size of a postcard. If you happen to find them, you may find a vertical crease down them. If you find one with a vertical crease, it means that was sent through the mail, whereas the ones that don't have a crease, those were given away in the lobby of the Ellicott Square building. Besides the mail order business that he did from there, he also sold single stamps, many of them on cards like this. And for those that saw the other stamp chat, this is the only connection that I've ever found of Raynor Hubble being associated with William B. Hale. Now, William B. Hale had his name on 86 of stamps like this, but there's no documentation that Mr. Hubble and Mr. Hale ever met. And so it's pretty neat to have found that Mr. Hubble actually had some of Hale's stamps, likely acquired from another stamp dealer in 1901. So almost every year, Mr. Hubble, that he did mail order, he loved to promote stamp albums. And here's an advertisement in the fall of 1900 in one of the Buffalo newspapers promoting stamp album sales. Here is a 1900, November 1900 stamp journal from Rochester called the International Philatelic Review. There's that same image that was on that cover, and he was promoting stamp albums that he would sell. Don't you want one, or don't you want to give one to someone? And here's another one. This was in the Buffalo Commercial newspaper, and it says, the best possible Christmas gift, secure one for your boy. Mr. Hubble felt that if he could get people collecting at a young age, they would have an interest in philately throughout their life and possibly be a customer as well for that long. So the Pan American Exposition opened, let's see, about 5 months after this advertisement came out, and McKeel's Stamp News put out this special edition. Usually McKeel's had a cover that looked like a newspaper with a variety of articles on it. This was a wonderful cover with special artwork on it. And for those that remember Life magazine, this was an oversized magazine just like that, a really big publication. Mr. Hubble took out another ad with artwork, and it was a full-page ad. I'm sure that cost him a pretty penny, and it was offering all sorts of things. Let's scroll in here, and you can see there's that envelope with 100 sorted Pan American stickers. And he sold mailing cards. And he mentions at the top that we have placed upwards of 3 million of these stickers on the market, which means he was an incredible marketer. He would actually, by the end of the Pan American Exposition, sell 4.5 million of these souvenir stamps that he was associated with. Now, that was before the internet, before television, before radio, and it meant that all his sales had to be either in person or through the mail, through his extensive advertising. It was such an amazing achievement for him. Now, a couple weeks after that one came out, the Metropolitan Philatelist was issued by John W. Scott of Scott Catalog fame, and it was a Pan American Exposition issue. And again, Raynor Hubble took out a full-page ad, and I loved it. He devoted a third of it just to artwork at night of the electric tower at the exposition. Here he mentions he sold over 3.5 million of those stamp stickers, he called them at the time. He sold Midway hats and badges and buttons and pins and posters. He mentions here that you haven't seen Buffalo unless you've seen our shop in the Ellicott Square building. And he did a lot of business then during the exposition. In the summer of the exposition, several of the philatelic organizations held their annual conventions in Buffalo, and that was noted in these Buffalo Evening News articles. Men who collect stamps are here. Philatelic societies are in session. It also mentions that Raynor Hubble of Buffalo is chairman of the Committee of Arrangements, and a trip to Niagara Falls has been planned for the entertainment of visitors. And sure enough, these are the visitors that went to Niagara Falls in late August of 1901. Now, for those that saw the other stamp chat, this is the Niagara River here, the water after it went over the falls. If you can just see very faintly, this is the bridge on the Bridge and Whirlpool stamp. So it was, this is taken in the gorge at the Niagara River. And if you look at the back row here, number 12 happens to be Mr. Raynor Hubble. This is the earliest picture that I've ever found of our giant of philately. I located it in the APRL after my book was published, and I still do research on Mr. Hubble and Mr. Hale. I love it. It's just a passion that I have, and it was such a treat to be able to locate this photograph of Mr. Hubble. Now, as the Pan American Exposition wound down, he wound up starting to liquidate his stock. This is a September advertisement in one of the Buffalo newspapers. He had books, he had photos, he had buttons, and look at this at the bottom, 1,023 packages of Pan Am stickers at 3 cents a piece, never sold before for less than 10 cents per package. And it was amazing. So as we wrap up the Pan American Exposition portion of this, I wanted to share one cover that I just love, and it's got building stamps on it, 6 brown building stamps on this cover to New Orleans, and 11 on the back. That's a total of 17 on this one cover. It's just a gem, and I just love it. So not a lot is known about Mr. Raynor Hubble after the Pan American Exposition closed in 1901. There's a few tidbits, a few classified ads. He closed the retail business in the Ellicott Square building, actually, and he went back to selling through at 172 Franklin Street. Now, I did locate this advertisement. It was in the Maston Park Chronicle. And if there's anybody from Western New York here, first a shout out to you and thanks for being here. But you may know of Maston Avenue and the Maston Avenue Armory where events take place. And Mr. Hubble was noted for selling his stamps from his home address of 172 Franklin Street. Now, I want to share real quickly a little bit of the writing in my book and also quote Mr. Hubble in his own words from his book that he later published. And I'll start here. Raynor later shared a story that reflected how his personal activities took an interesting turn about this time. He was happy with his lot in life. He met a gal, and after courting her a while, he proposed, and she said yes. Hubble then approached her dad to see if he could obtain his daughter's hand in marriage. Raynor went on to say himself, quote, "What do you do for a living, young man?" the father asked. "I own a stamp business." "A what?" thundered the father. "I told the gentleman that I had a business in downtown Buffalo, a growing bank account, and assured him that the young lady's prospects were good insofar as taking care of his daughter was concerned. The father replied, "No daughter of mine is ever going to marry anyone with as poor a future as a stamp dealer. You'll never amount to anything if you stick to those stamps. Get a job that amounts to something, and when you've kept it for a year, come back, and we'll talk about you marrying my daughter then." So Raynor took the advice, unquote, by the way. So Raynor took the advice, sold his stamp business, and he set aside Philately. He found employment in the office of the New York Central Railroad, yet his relationship status remained single. The young businessman concluded his own story with, quote, "By the way, the girl married the other fellow. She got married 6 months after I started with the New York Central." So that was around 1908 when that occurred. But 4 years later, Mr. Hubble did get married to a lady named Miss Grace Roberts, and they honeymooned at the Hayward Hotel in Los Angeles, California. This is Miss Roberts and or Mrs. Raynor Hubble. She was actually active through a lot of civic organizations. And the next photograph that I can share is of Raynor Hubble when he was 46 years old. He left the New York Central and he got active in the food business, where he would remain for decades. And this came from an industry trade magazine. It mentions at the bottom that he was a good fellow and he had a great reputation. Every single thing that I found about Raynor Hubble suggests that this guy was a gentleman. He had integrity. He was a good fellow to know, and he treated people really well. In fact, he dealt in food services in the canning business, and he has his name on the bottom as a distributor of Gorton's ready to fry codfish cakes. This is from 1928. If you haven't eaten dinner yet, you can just open a can and shape this stuff into cakes and fry it up, and there's your dinner. And Mr. Hubble wound up being in this business until the late 40s. And when it was time to retire, and he wound up writing this giant of philately, August Dietz. He actually wrote his son, August Dietz Jr., on Pomona Products Company Stationery. That was the food business company that he worked with until he retired a few months later. But he connected with the Dietz family because he had an idea about stamps that he wanted to collect and he wanted to become a niche dealer in. And that was Confederate stamps and covers for the next several years. Mr. Hubble believed that there would be a resurgence in these type of material, especially when 1961 approached, which would be the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. So he wanted the help of the Dietz family to produce some pamphlets, which he sold throughout the 1950s. His first one's in the upper left here, the gray with blue, and then he put out Observation of a Veteran Confederate Philatelist. Beneath that was collect some Confederate stamps before 1961, what I think will happen and why, and what I think they are worth and why. Here's a revision from 1957 with a picture of them on it. And look at the bottom here, the Dietz Printing Company. So he was getting active in this area of philately, and boy, would his involvement grow to an unbelievable height. And one of the arms that he used to do that was the weekly Philatelic Gossip. And here's a full page ad. I mean, it costs a lot of money to put a full page ad in a publication, especially when he wasn't selling things. So he was talking to his prospective clients. The best way to sell these items is by personal contact. And do you want to see me on one of my trips? He was by then doing a lot of stamp shows, and you could write to him and say, I am interested in these wares, bring them to the stamp show. So Mr. Hubble also became friends with the managing editor, Henry Weiss, and he was not only doing large advertisements like this, a double page ad, there's that little stamp booklet in there. Again, he wasn't selling a lot. He was promoting the hobby in a way that really many others were not, especially this niche. And when he couldn't afford to do large ads, he would put smaller ads saying, I do not make mouse traps, but I specialize in this area of philately. And so he talked Mr. Weiss, who became a really good friend, into doing a column regularly. Here's his picture in it, and his in number to the Confederate Stamp Alliance. And he put out Confederate corner columns on a regular basis in the 1950s. Here's some of them, a variety of them that he did, and they spread a lot of information to those that were interested in collecting that way. It was a real treat to the hobby itself, and he wanted to get people involved in this area of collecting. He also convinced editor Harry Weiss to do an annual Confederate special edition, and this is the first one that was put out. This is from 1951, and they put this other giant of philately, August Dietz Sr., on the front cover. And Raynor convinced Mr. Weiss to do this every year, and there were 10 more issues that came out. Here are the 10 covers for those special issues, and hopefully it would draw more collectors into this area of philately. He continued to do advertising extensively, just like he had done in the 1890s. And when he didn't have a big ad, he'd do a small one. Here's Confederate headquarters. He called his business on Poplar Street, and he used this P.O. box as well. And he says the best way to buy Confederates, pick them out yourself at Tampa. And this is a certificate that was given to him for being a dealer at this Tampa stamp show that was sponsored by the Society of Philatelic Americans. And I love that this certificate was given to him and other dealers. It certainly is different from our practice today, and kind of a charming one at that. And from 1953 to 1955, Mr. Hubble served as a president for the Confederate Stamp Alliance. Here's he's noted here, and boy, was he in good company of other presidents. There's August Dietz Sr., Stanley Ashbrook, Van Dyke McBride. They were all well known in this area of philately. So this is another reason why I really champion Mr. Hubble as an overlooked giant of philately. Here's one of his lists. This one was put out in 1956, and it had a lot of offerings. His wife, Grace, was helping him a lot during this time, and unfortunately, and they had some other projects on the burner as well. And unfortunately, Grace passed away in 1957. She had also been with him when he was at a lot of those stamp shows as well. So Mr. Hubble had to carry on himself and finish up some of those projects on his own. Here's that same picture. He would have been 83 years old here, and he works on the theory that that at least some Confederate stamps and covers should be in every U.S. collection to represent that portion of postal history of our country, regardless of geographic location of the collector. He liked to say that he had his 1 foot in the North and 1 foot in the South, being born in Buffalo, and they had lived in Louisville, Kentucky in the 20s, and then moved to Griffin, Georgia in the 30s. And he liked to say he had 1 foot in the North and 1 foot in the South. And this had nothing to do with politics, but enjoying the history and collecting it. So at the end of 1958, he took the text for his first book to the printer, and this was it, Confederate Stamps, Old Letters in History. It's actually the only book he ever wrote, but I love this dedication to his wife, Grace Roberts Hubble, who 6 years ago started this book with me. She died before it finished, and I have carried on, and I can still hear her gentle voice occasionally saying, "Ray, you talk too much. I hope to have not talked too much in some features of this book." And when I read this, it's like, oh, I would have loved to have met this man and just talked forever with him. And here's some pages inside of the book. There's covers and stories. It really showed his passion for this area of collecting, and it was just an amazing thing that he did to put forward this area of collecting in a way that hadn't been done before. Like before, he was advertising in stamp journals, but he was also advertising or well known in the conventional press because he sent books to them. And there were columns in many big city newspapers on stamps, either on the weekends or another day, but just on stamps alone. And so those that wrote them reviewed his book. Here's a book review from St. Louis, and the reviews were great about this thing. By the way, the book sold over 3,000 copies, and that's the same thing as having a New York Times bestseller. Moving that many copies of a philatelic book is really, really amazing. And he mentions here at the bottom, the reviewer does, that interest in America from 1861 is merely superficial, but you'll find in this book a treasure of information and pictures. Now, his mail order was just booming at this time. Here's the Weekly Philatelic Gossip from 1958, and he just didn't have a classified ad or a one-page ad or a center spread. Mr. Hubble's business had grown so much that he had a 10-page ad in here in 1958. That is something that only a giant of philately would do. The first 3 pages, the cost of one page is extensive. The first 3 pages are just informational, which is great for him sharing information about our hobby. And the extent that he listed 325 or so items in this advertisement is incredible. Today, the value of these would likely be, I want to say if these ads or these covers were $100 today, it'd be $32,000. But many of these covers can sell well over $1,000 today, which would bring them up well over $250,000 worth of stock that Mr. Hubble had at the time. Another thing that mentioned that he's definitely a giant of philately that may not get the play that we know. Here's an invoice from 1960 after we look at his picture at his desk where he's 85 years old. And by the way, he was also doing fall advertising again. He had his book mentioned here. He had the Dietz Confederate catalog available through him here, and Herman Hurst's NASA Street, which is actually still a wonderful book to read today. The stories inside are terrific. And Mr. Hubble was offering those. And I mentioned that he was still active. This is December 31st, 1960 invoice that he had from things that he bought from a dealer in Boston. And look at these prices. He spent $10,000 with this fella. $10,000 in 1960 could, $12,000 could buy you a house. $2,000 was sometimes what someone made in a year, certainly what a car cost. And Mr. Hubble was spending an incredible amount of money on inventory. So the Atlanta Journal got wind of him in 1961, which would have been the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. And it mentions here that Mr. Hubble has more Confederate stamps than any other dealer, although there are some millionaires and private collectors who have more of these things than I do. And about half of his stock and private collection of more than 1 million stamps is Confederate, and he has them insured for $100,000. So here's a cover from Griffin that he did some correspondence in. This is 1961, and this has his P.O. box of Griffin, Georgia on it. And he also advertised extensively in conventional newspapers, including this ad in the New York Times. I mean, the cost of a display ad in the New York Times is incredible. And he wanted to attract people wherever he could. And next up is a cover of the Weekly Philatelic Gossip from November 18th, 1961. And it notes on the front cover that this copy is the final issue that they printed. The magazine was purchased by another entity, but it was never issued again as the Weekly Philatelic Gossip. And his friend Harry Weiss was one that made the announcement there. I think it broke Raynor Hubble's heart. I really do, because it was only 3 weeks later that he passed away. And these are notices in the conventional newspapers: Albany, New York, Kansas City Times. Here's a longer one in Lynn's Stamp News. It mentions one of the oldest and best known stamp dealers in the United States. And despite his advanced age, he was both alert and active, and his extensive business steadily grew and expanded along new lines. He was a native of Buffalo, New York, settling in Georgia about 34 years ago. And Mr. Hubble was buried in Griffin at the Oak Hill Cemetery near his wife, Grace. And that's where he rests for eternity in the Hubble family plot. And I love telling the story of Mr. Hubble. Here he is in his advanced age, about 85 years old. Again, the more that I learned about him, the more that I just felt he was a giant in philately, and he had two philatelic lives that were really, really incredible. So thank you so much for listening to the story of Raynor Hubble that I've been able to uncover. I want to tip my hat to you for being here in this stamp chat. And his story, as well as that of William B. Hale, is in my book, Buffalo Cinderellas. Raynor Hubble is the gentleman in there. It's a high quality book, 180 pages on really nice stock. And here's some images from the Raynor Hubble, one of the Raynor Hubble chapters. There's over 300 images inside, not just in the middle of the book, but throughout. I wanted to have a nice flow. Most of them are in full color, and there's a lot of great postal history to enjoy as well. You do not have to be a stamp collector to enjoy this book. If you like historical biographies, you can certainly enjoy Buffalo Cinderellas, and stamp collectors can enjoy a terrific 24-page stamp appendix in the back where Mr. Hubble's stamps and the stamps associated with William B. Hale are pictured in full color in the back. All of them are there with numbers as well as a lot of details. So I want to thank you so much for being here tonight. Here's my contact information. If you have any questions or comments of any kind, I also have a Facebook page, and you don't have to be a Facebook member or have joined Facebook to enjoy the Facebook page, which started 5 years ago and has not only things about my research that I've done, but things that I've noted after the book was published. So thank you so much. It's just wonderful to share with you all.
That was fabulous. You're such an adroit storyteller, Rick. Thank you so much. You bring so much energy to all that you bring when you're on Stamp Chat, and I really, really appreciate it. And I know that anyone watching you either on YouTube or live feels the same way. Yes, very entertaining to be sure. You're welcome. We have a question. This was one that was posted earlier. Is the Hubble postage due catalog from the Crawford collection as noted on the cover?
Is the Hubble postage due
catalog?
I don't know. I'd have to check my files. I'm quite confident that it came from either the APRL or possibly the Smithsonian, who were helpful. If you want to email me, I could look in my folder and possibly give you a clearer answer.
It is incredible that that man had 1 million Confederate stamps.
Really incredible. I mean, when we think of stock today in any dealer's stock, it's just amazing. You know, there are several Confederate dealers who are terrific, and I'm sure they would admire Mr. Hubble's interest in that area of philately.
What happened with his collection? Do you know?
I don't know. I believe that some members of the Confederate Stamp Alliance that I had met at a show in Richmond, Virginia in 2017. I went there because I was privileged to actually meet a couple people who had met Mr. Hubble. That's why I went, and they were youngsters at the time, but several others knew of Mr. Hubble, and I believe one of the dealers mentioned that how the estate was liquidated, but I don't have that on the tip of my tongue at this moment. It had to be either through another dealer or through stamp auctions, and it was probably done by his daughter. They had one adopted child named Ruth, and Ruth might have done that.
Our questioner who had asked about the postage due, the first question.
Sure.
Go back to the slide with the postage due catalog.
All right, let's see how we can reach that one. Here we go. Can you see that? Or are we still?
We're still on the final
see.
slide.
Okay, let's see. I might have to share screen again and
No
click
problem.
on this. How's that?
There we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, this is, I've only seen this once. I mean, so many of the things that I've come across, either in the APRL, I was made aware of several resources at the Smithsonian, and you know, I've been lucky to find a couple stamp journals from Buffalo. I have one here, Queen City Philatelist from 1885, but Mr. Hubble would have only been 11, so I don't think, you know, he's not in here. This is only a 12-page thing, but I doubt there's more than one copy of a lot of these things that survive.
And this postage due catalog from the Crawford collection, as noted on the cover.
I see. Okay, gotcha. Crawford, and maybe I don't know, that might be an auction lot number up there or something to do with their filing system. I'm happy to check and see where I have it. Sometimes my notes might provide a little more background.
Perfect. Yes, you know, people in the hobby, we are very detail oriented. So the fact that somebody could even see that, that speaks volumes to
Yes.
those in the hobby.
Yes.
What was your, I remember on our last Stamp Chat, and friends, you can find Rick Barrett's Stamp Chat on our APS YouTube channel, where he spoke of the swindler part of his book. Did you go on a wild goose ride for this gentleman as well? Where you know, when I saw the cemetery, I wondered if you had gone there.
Well, my dear mom still lives in Buffalo, so of course I got to go back and you know, have a wonderful family visit from time to time, and I could, you know, that's how I found his home on Franklin Street. I spent a lot of time at the Buffalo Library doing microfilm work there. I'd love to do that again when we're able. And I did not make it to Griffin, Georgia. That was on my radar and didn't come about. But my trip to Richmond, Virginia put me in touch with so many fine people that were collecting Civil War postal history, and that have been wonderful resources. In fact, I got an email from one today, and I'm just privileged to still have those connections. So I love going on the wild goose chases, and I'll follow whatever leads I've been given.
You do, and you are the pluperfect example for using the APRL and the philatelic community to really be able to, you know, get these stories out there. It's phenomenal.
It's a lot of fun. I can say that, you know, Scott Tiffany was a huge help, and especially early on, and I would get 5 books a month from the APRL and go through them literally page by page. I would have to guess where they might advertise. A lot in New England, New York, you know, Long Island. There were so many stamp journals in the 1890s. It was amazing, and different qualities. A lot of funny things in there, but I was going through those page by page. And by the time I was done and had a list of what I'd checked out, there was over 50,000 pages that I would go through. I mean, there were nights I was, you know, reading and I would laugh out loud at some of these editors. I'd wake my wife up, and you know, one would say that this journal is not worth the paper that it's printed on, you know, and there was some hilarious back and forth from these various editors. And every time I would find something on Mr. Hubble or Mr. Hale, I was in heaven. You know, there were advertisements, columns that they would write, letters to the editor, sometimes different mentions. It was great.
You really unveil such a colorful side to the hobby. It's always a pleasure, Rick, for when you join us. And I'm just looking over at the chat box, and for the book that you've written, Buffalo Cinderellas, is highly recommended by those who have read it. You're receiving lots of testimonials here in the chat box, and for our friends that will watch it later on YouTube. Again, very noteworthy book, great photos, and it's found in the APRL, as a matter of fact.
That's right.
So I'd love to have Rick Barrett back in February. You can look forward to the American Philatelist. The issue will be devoted to philatelic research. So whether it's more academic in nature or more anthropological and storytelling, all of those facets can be covered. And again, we have APRL staff who are just at the ready, and people like Rick Barrett who have used those services and came up with a book. So we thank you.
I want to close by saying, Heidi, that, I never anticipated what would come. I thought I would have a 12-page or 16-page pamphlet, and this whole experience was miraculous in many ways. I got to meet so many just terrific people. And again, I just followed the leads. It was always a labor of love, never a money-making thing. And I think it illustrates what we can do. And I encourage others, because, so many of us collectors, we may have boxes of things. And if there's an interest and an area of philately that you gravitate to, write an article for the American Philatelist magazine, write something for your Stamp Club newsletter, or write a book, take it to another level, because your enjoyment will be greater, as well as those that you share it with. So thanks so much, Heidi, and everyone else. Thank you.
Oh, you have me shaking my head, and I'm in the amen corner. That was very, very well said, Rick. In addition to writing, I know that Dr. Michelle Bresso, who's on this, is live in our audience tonight. She's offering a workshop through the American Topical Association on presenting PowerPoints. So that's another way that people can express their love and share. That this really is a hobby of sharing. And you will always gather an audience, and you'll always have people curious. So thanks so much, and thank you for being such a sincere advocate of the APRL, Rick. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
And friends, thank you for joining us tonight, and to everyone who will be watching on the APS YouTube channel, where this and so many other stamp chats can be found and are evergreen in nature. Today's Stamp Chat is brought to you by the APRL, one of the world's largest philatelic libraries. Access to the library is part of your APS membership. The APRL offers photocopying and scanning services, as well as reference assistance by phone and email. And believe me, friends, even though the APC is closed, you can get on the phone, you can use your email, and our friendly staff is ready and waiting to help you. For more information on the APRL, visit stamps.org. Stay up to date with upcoming stamp chats. Go to stamps.org and subscribe to our bi-monthly newsletter. For more stamp chats, of course, you can go and see them on the APS YouTube channel, where you'll find presentations from all aspects of the hobby. Be sure to like and subscribe, and use the comment box below to keep the conversation going. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next Stamp Chat. Until then, connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and of course on stamps.org. The APS, social since 1886. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.